Winter had already claimed the city long before the first snow began to fall. The streets were pale with frost, and even the sound of footsteps seemed softer, as though afraid to break the silence. Beneath an old bridge that arched over a frozen river, a small family had built their world from what others had thrown away. Thomas, the father, was a man who once worked with his hands, strong hands, that now trembled in the cold. Beside him, wrapped in a torn blanket, his wife Grace tried to keep their son, Leo, warm. He was only 8, but already understood hunger. They had been living under that bridge for nearly 2 months. The city shelters were full, the food lines long, and the nights unforgiving. Thomas had managed to fix an old camping stove, scavenged from a pile near the dumpsters behind the bus station. On good days, they could heat a can of soup. On bad days, they simply held the pot above a candle and called it dinner. Grace never complained. She smiled even when her lips cracked from the cold, telling Leo stories of summers by the lake and the sound of crickets that once lulled them to sleep. Leo listened to every word. He didn't remember much of their old home, just flashes of color, the smell of pancakes, the sound of his mother humming while his father hammered nails into something sturdy. Now the world was white and gray. He collected bottle caps, shiny bits of glass, and small treasures buried in the snow. One morning, while Thomas searched for firewood and Grace sorted through their worn bags, Leo wandered near the riverbank. The snow there was deeper, untouched. His boots sank with each step, crunching softly like breaking sugar. Something glimmered near the edge of the frozen water, small, metallic, half buried beneath a thin layer of ice. Leo crouched down, brushed the snow away, and found it. A key. It was heavy and old, its metal darkened by years, shaped unlike any he'd seen before. The handle was ornate, twisted like ivy, and on one side, faint letters had been worn nearly invisible. He turned it over in his mittened hand, feeling its cold bite against his skin. It looked important, like it once belonged to something that mattered, maybe even something still waiting to be found. When he returned to the camp, he held it up proudly. "Look what I found." Thomas glanced up from the stove, squinting. "A key?" "Yeah, it was in the snow by the river." Grace smiled weakly. "Maybe it opens a treasure chest." Thomas chuckled. "Or someone's old toolbox." But when he took it from Leo, he frowned. The key had a strange symbol carved into the top, a small pine tree within a circle. "I've seen that before," he murmured. "Somewhere in the woods outside town." Grace raised her head. "The woods? Tom, it's miles from here." He nodded slowly. "I know." That night, the wind roared beneath the bridge like a living thing. Snow drifted down in slow, soundless sheets. Thomas lay awake, staring at the dark concrete above them. He thought about the key the way it had appeared, as if waiting for them. In the morning, he packed their few belongings. The blanket, the pot, a half loaf of bread wrapped in paper. Grace looked at him with tired eyes. "Where are we going?" He held up the key. "Somewhere this belongs." She didn't ask more. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that cut through the cold. They followed the river north, moving slowly through the snow. The city's edge fell behind them, replaced by silence and trees heavy with frost. Leo walked between his parents, holding the key like it was a compass. By noon, the sun broke through the clouds, washing the forest in pale gold. They crossed an old railway line, then followed a narrow path that twisted between pines. Thomas felt something deep in his chest, not hope exactly, but its faint echo. Every crunch of snow beneath their boots felt like a heartbeat. The key swung gently from Leo's mittened hand, catching the light. By afternoon, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a small cottage half hidden by trees, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. A broken fence surrounded it, and smoke stains darkened the chimney stones, though no smoke rose now. Thomas stopped, breath visible in the cold air. "I knew this place," he whispered. "I helped build it years ago, back when I worked construction. The man who owned it said he'd never sell." Grace looked at the door. "Do you think—" He nodded, reaching into Leo's coat pocket. "Let's find out." The lock was old and rusted, the handle stiff. Thomas slid the key in. It fit perfectly. The sound of the latch turning echoed like a memory through the empty woods. When he pushed the door open, a faint smell of pine and dust drifted out, the scent of a place long forgotten but not abandoned. Inside, the air was cold but clean. Light poured through cracked shutters, illuminating a small room with wooden floors, a fireplace of stone, and shelves lined with cobwebs. It wasn't much, but to them, it felt like a cathedral. Grace stepped inside first, her breath trembling in the still air. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Leo ran to the fireplace, brushing off the ashes. "Can we make a fire, Dad?" Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yeah, I think we can." He gathered old logs from the corner, splintered but dry enough to burn. Within minutes, smoke began to curl upward, and flames danced orange and soft against the stone. The warmth spread slowly, like a memory returning. Grace sat near the fire, her hands outstretched. For the first time that winter, her fingers didn't shake. The cottage was small, one main room, a narrow kitchen, and a loft that could barely hold a mattress. On the table, they found an old tin box filled with nails, a few candles, and a folded note yellowed with age. Grace opened it carefully. It read, "Want you a nod? If you ever need shelter, this house will keep you warm. There's wood in the shed and food beneath the floor. When you leave it ready for the next soul. J.T." Thomas stared at it. "That was him," he said softly. "The man who owned this place. I remember his name." Leo found a loose board near the fireplace and pried it open. Beneath it lay a small wooden box containing jars of beans, matches, and a bundle of blankets. Grace laughed through tears. "It's like he knew we were coming." Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe he just knew someone would need it someday. They spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, sweeping dust from corners, stacking wood by the fire. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the small cottage, the world finally stood still. When the last bit of sunlight faded, the fire's glow filled every shadow. That night, they ate beans from a can and drank melted snow. Grace sat by the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Thomas looked around the room, eyes tracing every beam, every mark left by the man who built it. "It's strange," he said softly. "I worked on this place with him. He said he wanted it to outlast him." Leo yawned. "It did, Dad." Thomas smiled. "Yeah, I guess it did." He lay down beside the fire, the warmth humming through the floorboards. Outside, the snow deepened, but the storm no longer felt like an enemy. Days passed. They repaired what they could. Grace scrubbed the counters with melted snow and ash, humming as she worked. Thomas fixed the broken door hinge using wire from the stove. Leo gathered pine cones, pretending they were treasures. Every morning, they woke to the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft creak of the wind through the walls. It wasn't comfort in the way people imagined. It was something simpler, more honest. A roof, a fire, and the knowledge that someone once cared enough to leave the world a little warmer. On the 5th day, Thomas walked to the edge of the clearing. The snow had stopped, and sunlight shimmered off the trees like glass. He thought about the bridge, the gray concrete, the cold ground, the sound of cars passing overhead. He realized that the distance between misery and mercy could sometimes be measured in footsteps or the turn of a single key. When he returned, Leo was carving something into a piece of wood with a small knife they'd found in a drawer. "What are you making?" Thomas asked. Leo smiled. "A sign." By evening, the sign was done. The letters were crooked, but the message was clear. For those who wander. They nailed it above the door. Grace touched it gently. "It's perfect." The next morning, they placed a note beside the old one on the table. "This house saved us. If you find it, may it save you too. Leave warmth for whoever comes next." The Walkers. Thomas folded the original note beside it, the two messages resting together like generations shaking hands across time. As the days grew longer, they began to plan. They would stay through winter, fix the roof when spring came, maybe plant something behind the cottage. Grace smiled more now. She sang softly when she cooked, her voice thin but steady. Leo played outside, building forts of snow and calling them kingdoms. Sometimes, Thomas would watch him through the window and think that maybe, for the first time in a long while, they weren't surviving. They were living, all because a key decided to appear at the right place on the coldest morning of their lives. One evening, Thomas found himself staring at the key, still hanging by the door. He turned it over in his hands. The metal no longer felt cold. He thought of the man who once built this house, J.T., and wondered if he ever knew what he'd started. Maybe he'd left this cabin not for one person, but for everyone who'd ever needed proof that kindness doesn't die. It just waits. In that moment, Thomas made a promise. When spring came, they would help someone else find their own warmth, the way this house had found them. That night, as snow fell again, Leo whispered from his blanket, "Mom, do you think the man who built this was lonely?" Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe once, but not anymore." Thomas looked at the fire, listening to its soft, steady rhythm. "No," he said. "He's still here in every spark." The flames danced higher, filling the room with light. Outside, the snow glowed faintly in the moonlight, and for the first time in a long time, the family slept without fear, their dreams warmed by the memory of a stranger's kindness. Morning arrived quietly, the world blanketed in peace. Thomas stepped outside, the key in his hand. The sign above the door swayed gently in the wind. He smiled, slid the key back into his pocket, and whispered, "Thank you." Behind him, Grace and Leo stood in the doorway, framed by the glow of the fire. The cabin stood strong, a small miracle in a world too often cold. And somewhere beyond the forest, under another bridge, or behind another forgotten wall, someone else waited for their turn, their key, and the warmth still left in the world. By late winter, the cottage had learned their rhythms, and they had learned its voice. The fire complained in soft crackles when it needed wood. The door sighed in a draft until Thomas slipped felt into the seam. The roof knocked politely whenever snow slid from the ridge. Grace moved like sunlight through the small room, humming as she wiped shelves with warm water. Leo discovered favorite places, the loft's low window for watching deer, the step where he lined pine cones by size. Outside, the forest wore a quiet silver. Inside, the world narrowed to warmth, chores, and long, gentle evenings. Food remained simple: beans, bread made from a stubborn sack of flour, the occasional stew stretched with melted snow and patience. Thomas rationed carefully, then taught Leo to count jars by weeks. Not days' hope lasts longer when it's measured. Grace wrote small lists in pencil on brown paper and crossed items off with satisfaction rare in hard seasons. On the coldest nights, they ate early and saved embers for morning. They discovered that gratitude tastes stronger when shared. Leo insisted on leaving one spoonful in the pot for luck, and the next day's first bite always felt like a promise kept. Storms came less often, but harder. One blew until dawn, shoving wind through the firs like a river, packing snow against the door, throwing splinters of ice at the windows. At first light, Thomas pulled his coat and cleared the drift with a shovel he'd straightened from the shed. The cottage held. When he returned, cheeks raw, Grace had warmed stones by the hearth and tucked them into socks for his boots. Little inventions stitched their days together. That night, while Leo slept, Thomas whispered, "We should fix the roof before spring rains." Grace nodded, and then plant something worth waiting for. The idea of planting felt almost extravagant, like laughter had the nerve to sleep in the soil and wake up green. They had no seeds beyond a few beans and a handful of potatoes sprouting white threads like questions. "It's a start," Grace said. Thomas saved the best ones in a bowl near the window, turning them carefully each day. When the thaw began, in a whisper, drops ticking from the eaves, snow slumping away from the steps they planned, the repair. Patch the ridge, replace 2 warped boards, reset the flashing with tar from an old can that still remembered summer. They waited for a clear morning. The sky opened pale and clean. The air smelled of wet bark. Thomas tested each rung of the ladder twice. "I'll pass you nails," Leo said, serious in his father's spare hat. The boy carried a tin that once held biscuits and now guarded screws like treasure. Grace stayed below, steadying the ladder with one hand and warming tar with the other. The cottage seemed to straighten while they worked, as if it enjoyed being noticed. When a gust nudged Thomas near the ridge, he paused, breathed, and found his balance exactly where he once lost it. They broke only for bread and hot water, sweetened with a single square of chocolate Leo had saved since December. For a victory day, he'd promised. "This is one," Grace declared, breaking it into thirds. By afternoon, the new boards sat snug and sensible. The flashing lay down like a calm thought. Thomas ran his palm along the ridge, feeling the plain satisfaction of lines that meet. He climbed down slowly, joints protesting, and stood beside Grace and Leo, all three looking up at work that would keep them dry. "Roof's a sentence," he murmured. "It only makes sense when finished." Cleaning came next. Snow melt made opportunity of dirt. They opened the door wide to coax out the winter's stale breath, beat the blankets, and sorted the shed. Tools in one corner, wood in another, a collection of might-be-usefuls in a crate Leo labeled with crooked pride. Grace found a small rug under the bed, shook it until the day turned into a soft dust of yarn. Late afternoon brought a golden hush through the windows. For the first time, the cottage looked less like refuge and more like home, still humble, still borrowed from kindness, but shaped by hands that meant to stay. It was Leo who found the trapdoor. He came skidding in from the shed with cheeks flushed, slipped on the rug, and thumped the floor with his heel. The sound echoed differently hollow, curious. "Under here," he said, tapping. Thomas fetched a knife and pried up the edge of a board near the hearth, revealing a square of dark wood with a small iron ring, rusted but not stubborn. The door lifted with a dry sigh, releasing a breath of cool, paper-scented air. Beneath lay a shallow space lined in old cedar, and inside it bundles tied with twine, neat as sleeping birds. They set the bundles on the table, hesitant, reverent. The twine crumbled under Thomas's thumb. Inside the first bundle lay envelopes browned at the edges, a notebook wrapped in cloth, and a photograph gone soft with handling. The image showed a man and a woman beside the cottage when its boards were new. The man stocky, hat cocked, a carpenter's grin. The woman with braid pinned like a promise. On the back, in a hand clear and sure, J, T, and M, first spring. Grace traced the initials. J.T., she whispered. Thomas nodded. The one who left the note. He had a partner. The notebook bore the same letters on the cover, J.T., and inside, dates marched along neat pencil lines. Deliveries, repairs, weather shrugged into margins, like snow rude today and wind bossy. Between these dailies, entries opened like doors. We built it for winters when strangers would need a fire more than we needed an extra room. Another page. If we keep an extra of everything, maybe kindness will be the habit that saves us, not money. Grace pressed her fingers to her mouth. Leo leaned closer. He planned for us, the boy breathed. Not us, Thomas said softly. But yes. The letters were addressed to nobody and everybody. Friend, they often began, as if continuing a single conversation across seasons. One told how J.T. found a man collapsed by the ravine and carried him in on a door, laughing. Entrance fees a breath. Another described a blizzard that pinned them for 3 days while M read aloud from a cookbook like it were scripture. We ate biscuits shaped like mercy, J.T. wrote, and Grace laughed, the sound catching and turning into something gentler. The cottage seemed to lean closer. Thomas felt that rarest thing permission to belong to a good story. They read until the fire turned to a cradle of coals. In one envelope, folded smaller than the rest, they found the key's twin same ivy curl, same small pine inside a circle. With it, a map traced in careful strokes from town to river to trees, a dotted line to the door. If you ever forget the way, the letter said, follow smoke where there are no footprints. The wind will point. The ridge will echo. The door will forgive the late. Leo held the old key in his palm, then his own, then both. 2, he said, as if that meant forever. A longer entry told of M, the woman in the photograph. She was a teacher once, then a nurse when the nearest clinic closed. M keeps lists of names we owe and names we're owed, then forgets to collect either, J.T. wrote with pride. Another entry, quieter. The baby didn't make it through winter. The sentence sat alone, a small house on a wide field. They stopped reading for a long time. Grace closed her eyes. Thomas reached for her hand under the table. The fire did the only holy thing it knows, kept burning, the same for joy as for sorrow. Spring came in fits and kindnesses, puddles flattering the sky. The first thin ribbon of runoff in the ditch, sap learning to be a river again. They began to plant, fingers blunt from winter turning soil that had not been touched in years. Potatoes went into a bed bordered by stones. Beans lined a trench Leo measured with a stick and large dignity. Grace tucked onion sets into soft furrows as if swaddling small patient moons. Between rows they left a path to the shed and hung a tin bell from the eave. It chimed when wind remembered them, a steady, unearned blessing. On evenings too warm for the stove, they read more of J.T.'s notebook on the steps. They learned the cottage once had a second door that snow stole in a tantrum. They learned M sang lullabies when storms argued with the roof. J.T. fixed leaks by lantern and wrote down the sizes of every nail used in case memory ever got hungry. Near the end, a list titled, "If We're Gone." Leave wood in triangles. Keep matches in 3 places. Write a letter before you need it. Trust strangers enough to make them friends. Leo copied the last line carefully, lips moving. They decided to add their own pages. Grace began a new notebook stitched from brown paper and twine, her handwriting steady, elegant. The Walker's book, she lettered on the first page, then wrote of the bridge, the key. The first night, the floor finally felt like forgiveness. Thomas recorded roof repairs, the angle of the flashing, even the count of shingles replaced. Leo drew the cottage 3 times, snowed, thawed, blooming, and on each drawing, he hid the key like a game future visitors would win by simply paying attention. They tucked the new book back under the floor beside J.T.'s. News travels along footpaths faster than on roads that pretend not to care. A hiker appeared one afternoon with a polite knock and a posture made of apology. "I saw the sign," she said, pointing to Leo's crooked. "For those who wander above the door, they made tea." She left a coil of rope and a small jar of jam with a label that read July like a weather forecast. Another day, a ranger knocked just to say hello, then checked the chimney with the tenderness of a doctor listening to a heart. "Keep this place as you found it," he said. "Open." Thomas walked to town once a week for flour and mail that never came, borrowing odd jobs where a careful hand mattered, mending a fence, freeing a stuck window, rewiring a switch with a patience winter taught him. He always returned before dark, pockets full of screws, his mind full of small improvements not worth boasting about. Grace traded a morning of sweeping at a store for a packet of carrot seeds and a tiny blue tin of salve. Slowly, Worth returned to their days in new currency. Favors traded, names remembered, weather predicted by the kindness of neighbors' voices. Late one soft night, rain stitched on the roof like someone hemming the world. They read the last letter in J.T.'s bundle. "If someone finds this when we are gone," it began, "know that the door is the truest part of any house. Keep it easy. Leave the latch honest. Write to the ones you'll never meet." Then a final line, simple as a hearth, signed, as always, a friend, J.T. They sat a while after that, listening to rain and the quiet labor of memory. When they slept, it was the deep sleep of people finally standing on their own ground. By early summer, the cottage wore green like a new thought. Beans climbed, potatoes shouldered leaves, onions stood in polite ranks. The bell chimed even when no wind moved. At least that's how it felt. On the table, beside J.T.'s letters, lay the Walker's new note for whoever came next. "This house saved us. If it finds you, let it. There's wood, food, and work. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Trust that it matters." Thomas slid the key from its nail, turned it once in his palm, and hung it back. Some doors stay open even when they're closed. By early autumn, the forest began to speak in deeper colors, the green thinning into honey and rust, the air tasting faintly of wood smoke even before any fire was lit. The Walkers measured time by small proofs, beans drying on twine, onions curing beneath the porch, the bell chiming whenever wind remembered their names. Leo kept a ledger of harvest on the first page of their new book, tally marks like tiny fence posts keeping order. Grace pressed leaves between notebook pages. Thomas walked the eaves with a small hammer, tapping down the summer. The cottage listened, pleased, readying itself for weather. Visitors came softer in autumn, voices lowered by distance, A pair of hikers traded a map annotated with springs for a supper of potato cakes and onions. A woman with a tired dog asked only to warm her hands, then left a pair of thick socks and a story about a brother who once believed in cabins the way other people believe in saints. The ranger returned with a quiet nod and 2 bundles of shingles cinched with twine. "Winter wrestles corners first," he said, tapping the roofline. Thomas smiled and understood. "Prepare the edges, and the center will keep." Grace began a habit of writing letters they would never send, one to JT&M, one to the cottage, one to the mountain itself. She read them aloud to Leo while he shelled beans into a bowl, the soft rattle like a measured rain. "We found your care. We are returning it," she wrote. "We have less fear now. We have the right kind of work." Leo asked if the mountain could read. "In weather," Grace answered. "In the way wind changes, in how snow drifts. Mountains read what we do with our hands." It sounded like a prayer because it was. Storm practice became a ritual. On clear days, Thomas rehearsed what only gales would require: latching shutters, checking the stovepipe, counting wood by weeks, then quietly adding one. He cut triangles of kindling and stacked them like small, clean sentences beside the stove. Leo chalked the chimney cap's shape in his notebook and then replicated it in scrap wood, a boy's faith that models tame the future. Grace refolded blankets into squares that would unfold into warmth without thought. They didn't chase certainty. They built familiarity, so when winter spoke, their hands would answer without asking the mind for permission. On an afternoon with light like warm tea, a man arrived carrying a guitar case dented by geography. He said little, played less, but his few notes loosened something in the room. He left a sealed envelope marked "For a hard day." They did not open it, honoring its instruction. "Why keep it closed?" Leo asked. "Because trust is sometimes heavier when we hold it," Thomas said, setting it beneath the lamp. The envelope stayed there all season, a quiet reserve of courage, proof that help can be present without being used, a promise that did not demand proof of need. The first hard wind rode in before the first hard snow, shouldering through the firs and combing the meadow with invisible fingers. The cottage braced, proud and honest. Thomas felt the roof settle like a steady animal. Grace fed the stove and laughed when the damper sighed. Enough, enough. Leo watched the bell. It rang without trembling, a sound caught between warning and welcome. That night, rain stitched and ripped in alternating lines. They spoke little, each listening for the part of the house they understood best. Thomas the roof, Grace the fire, Leo the door. All three did what they were meant to. When morning came, the world was rinsed and colder. Frost furred the porch rail. The bell wore a thin collar of ice. The ranger's shingles had been exactly the right number, no more, no less, which felt like a benediction from a man who counted weather as carefully as days. Thomas climbed once, tightened twice, and came down smiling, flexing his fingers as if he had tuned an old instrument. Grace brewed tea from pine needles and honey, tasting forest and summer at once. Leo drew a diagram of the cottage with arrows. Water goes here, wind goes there, warmth stays. In November, a family reached the door at dusk, snow clinging to their sleeves like pleading hands. They had the look Thomas recognized without asking, hungry, polite, afraid to take up space. Grace set bowls without ceremony. Leo slid a stool beside the stove and handed the boy his own age a cup of water like an heirloom. After supper, the father unfolded a crumpled letter. "If you find the cottage, it belongs to you for the night. Leave it ready for the next soul. He'd copied the words from a wall years earlier, carried them like a talisman. The circle tightened kindly. They stayed 2 nights, leaving more than they took. A repaired hinge, a mended glove, 3 neat bundles of kindling bound with red thread. Before leaving, the mother traced the line, for those who wander, with her fingertip, and whispered, "Thank you," without looking at anyone. Grace pretended to tidy the shelf so as not to witness a private ceremony made of gratitude and restraint. When the door hushed closed, Leo tucked the family's note into the tin with others. "We're running out of room," he said. Thomas smiled. "Then the world is learning to write to itself." Snow arrived late, but with confidence. It felt as if the sky had been holding its breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale. Drifts rose against the shed. The path to the spring braided itself shut. Thomas and Leo beat a track with the old snowshoes they'd found behind the rafters, laughter fogging in the air between steps. The first true cold brought its own math. How many armloads to reach midnight? How many embers to wake to orange? Grace revised her list's lamp oil, matches in 3 places, spare socks by the stove, a kettle always half full of comfort. In deepest cold, a stranger staggered into the yard with a dog whose ribs spelled the alphabet of hunger. Thomas met him at the steps with both palms up, the old sign that says, "We are not danger." The dog drank first, the man second, pride shelving itself briefly beside the door. He slept 12 hours by the fire, waking only to murmur a name none of them recognized. In the morning he fixed the gate without being asked, then left a folded map with phone numbers penciled at safe distances. "For later courage," he said. Leo added it to the wall like a window. There were frictions, small and human. One evening, a traveler used wood as if the forest would never notice, and Thomas felt an old fear return like ache. Grace placed the "For a Hard Day" envelope in his hand. He held it without opening until the heat in his chest lowered to useful. Then he wrote a note for the wall. "Wood is shared breath. Take what keeps you kind." The traveler read it in the morning and stacked 6 fresh triangles, cheeks pink with apology. The cottage made room for repairs like that, quiet, mutual, no tally kept. During a thaw that sounded like polite applause, mail finally found them delivered by the ranger, signed by nobody and everybody. A photocopy of a deed fragment, a county notice about stewardship easements, and a handwritten card from a librarian in town. "Heard what you're keeping alive. Come see me. We can keep it legal without caging it." Bureaucracy moved at the speed of winter sap, but kindness greased its wheels. Over weeks, they learned a new language: caretaker, right of access, commons. Thomas listened hard, spoke little, and said yes to anything that protected the door's honesty and the fire's future. The librarian, a woman with ink on her sleeve and patience in her grin, helped draft a simple pledge on a single sheet. "The Chain of Friends," the header read, as if it had been waiting for a name. Beneath it, "This place exists for those who need it. Keep it open. Leave it ready. Add what you can. Write to the ones you'll never meet." The ranger co-signed as witness. Neighbors added initials like stitches. They tacked a copy inside the door with brass thumbtacks that caught the light. It was not ownership. It was promise, framed by wood and winter. With the pledge came small changes that felt like clarity rather than rules. A shelf label "Leave" and another "Take," the space between them measured in mercy. A penciled calendar nobody enforced, but everyone respected 3 simple marks: cold front, dry wood, check chimney. Leo drew symbols for each so readers of few words could still feel included. A cloud with teeth for cold, a stack of smiling logs, a small square with an arrow for the clean-out hatch. Grace added a tin for letters that needed answers and wrote back, when reply was possible, beginning every note, "Dear friend." The solstice came with a calm so complete even the bell rested. They celebrated with unnecessary pancakes, and a jar of July jam opened, as if slicing summer. Thomas read aloud the last page of JT's notebook again. Grace placed a sprig of fir in a cup by the window. Leo set a new drawing on the mantel. The cottage in 4 seasons, tiny figures arriving and leaving, the door always mid-open. "What should we leave for the hardest January day?" he asked. Thomas lifted the still unopened envelope and set it gently beneath the lamp again. "Sometimes the gift is patience." January arrived like a teacher who knows your limits and intends to stretch them kindly. A storm pinned them inside for 2 days, then loosened its grip without apology. They shoveled in shifts, laughed when the path curved like a question, and paused often to listen to the stove's reassuring grammar. Visitors came bundled and brief, leaving more notes than footprints. One simply read, "Stayed alive, will return favors elsewhere." Grace copied it into their book because it felt like a new blessing, portable, anonymous, contagious. The chain tugged softly at a distance, and the cottage smiled in its timbers. Toward winter's end, the librarian arrived with a tin of tea and a county clerk whose coat still held city creases. They stood on the porch with breath like ribbons and signed a final page that used the right words in the right order. The clerk shook Thomas's hand, then Grace's, then ruffled Leo's hat with a formality that almost passed for affection. "You're legal," he said, as if warmth ever needed permission. But the paper made protection visible. They framed a copy simply and small. The mountain kept its larger copy in wind and snow, the way mountains certify things. When thaw returned, a slow kindness learning to walk, Thomas repaired the sled's runner. Grace swept winter out under the threshold. Leo planted carrot seed in a narrow bed, as if writing his name carefully on spring. Visitors shifted from boots to shoes, from silence to stories told on the porch with sleeves rolled, the bell clangorous with light. The chain of friends pledge yellowed at the corners in that dignified way paper learns. New names fill the book, old ones returning letters that smelled like other weather. The cottage held them all without preference, equal beneath a single roof. On the first warm night, they carried chairs into the yard and watched the window burn gold while dusk braided the trees. Thomas lifted the original key, now dulled to the color of memory, and hung it back on its nail. Grace set her hand on the door the way one greets a good friend. Leo rang the bell once clear. Bright enough. They would leave at dawn for supplies, returning as they always did. But the cabin would not be empty. It never truly was. Somewhere a traveler was already learning the path by heart. The door would forgive the late. The fire would speak first. A friend was here. Be one too.